them down as they go.
That's great.
Make sure this doesn't go off. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Doar, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, where I focus on the nation's large safety net programs and how free markets and strong families can best fight poverty and foster economic mobility and opportunity. For all the political tumult in our country, we are lucky to be living in a time of extraordinary economic health. The American economy is growing at a healthy pace. Unemployment is low. The New York Times even ran a story called "We Ran Out of Words to Describe How Good the Jobs Numbers Are," though they tried, calling the month of May's numbers splendid, excellent, and salubrious. I'm not even sure I know what salubrious means, but I'm sure you do, Dr. Strain.
We could talk about that after.
Okay.
And your other vocabulary deficiencies.
Yes, all right. Long, stagnant labor force participation rates have even ticked up, though we still have a ways to go in getting Americans, especially prime-age men, back into the labor force at the same participation rates as in the past. It is true that a strong economy is the best national anti-poverty program, and our economy's effect on major safety net programs is already apparent. Because more people are moving into employment and earnings, the number of recipients in the SNAP program, our food stamp program, has dropped by almost 4 million since November 2016. Getting people into jobs is the first step towards helping people out of poverty, but it also helps if wages rise as well. This event should help us answer a few questions related to the American worker. First, what does the future hold for those stubborn wages? Are large employers leading the way in helping their employees get ahead? Second, how are employers, especially leading American corporations, offering benefits that help employees' lives in other ways, with family responsibilities or further education or scheduling? Can these improvements and benefits make up for slow wage growth, or at least explain why wages are growing slowly? I am very happy to have with us representatives of 3 major players in the American corporate landscape. From Walmart, Kathleen McLaughlin; from FedEx, Chris Winton; and from JPMorgan Chase, Amanda Eversole. Each one of these representatives will share what her or his company is doing to improve their employees' lives in a variety of ways, starting with wages, but extending to other efforts to boost quality of life and chances for mobility, with a particular focus on entry-level and lower-skilled workers. We will begin with presentations from each of our corporate representatives, beginning with Kathleen, followed by Chris, and then Amanda, and then our own Dr. Michael Strain. AEI's Director of Economic Policy Studies will present a broader view of the landscape of labor market trends before we have a panel discussion on what more can be done, and we get questions from the audience. So let me just quickly give some bios on our guests. Kathleen McLaughlin is the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at Walmart and President of the Walmart Foundation. She serves on the board of the Council on Foundations and is a member of the committee encouraging corporate philanthropy's Strategic Investor Initiative Advisory Board. Before joining Walmart in 2013, she spent more than 20 years with the global consulting firm McKinsey & Company. Chris Winton is the Vice President of Human Resources for FedEx. His responsibilities include compensation, human resources analysis, organizational effectiveness, recruiting, performance management, and workforce strategy and planning. He is also the enterprise business lead for Workday at FedEx. Amanda Eversole is the head of public affairs for JPMorgan Chase, where she oversees communications, civic engagement, and strategy for the corporate responsibility team. Before joining the firm in September 2016, she served for 13 years as the United States Chamber of Commerce, where she was most recently president of the Center for Advanced Technology and Innovation. And finally, Dr. Michael Strain is the John G. Searle Scholar and Director of Economic Studies here at AEI. His research has been published in peer-reviewed academic journals and in the policy journals Tax Notes and National Affairs. He has also edited 2 books on economics and economic policy. He writes frequently for Popular Audience and is a regular contributor to Bloomberg View. I'm very appreciative of our guests today, and I'm very pleased that we have them, and I want to get the discussion started. And again, I thank all of you for being here. And Kathleen, take it away.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today and with everyone. I thought I would just start by framing how Walmart is approaching the question of helping current people working in retail advance in their careers. So I want to start off with just some context. So Walmart is a retailer. We're in about 28 countries worldwide. We have about 10,000 stores. We have 2.5 million people who work for Walmart worldwide, and 200-300 million people every week coming into Walmart around the world for food, apparel, things for their house. Food is our biggest business. And this is actually a picture of a store in Africa near Soweto. And the way that we think about maximizing value as a company is that there is an inextricable link between business value creation and societal value creation. So shared value, if you're familiar with Michael Porter at HBS, that the sort of notion that a company's value is maximized when it is addressing deep societal issues through the business, through the core business. So it's not CSR, it's not philanthropy, all those things are important. It really is a matter of how you're serving needs of society through the enterprise itself. So obviously, the main business is our primary way of doing that, serving these hundreds of millions of families around the world with safe, affordable food and other products. So that's very important. But of course, employment and local community relationships and so on all factor into that as well. For us as a retailer, there are 3 other arenas that have to do with how we go about doing our business, that if we do them well, enhance the business value, but also address societal issues. And as we address societal issues, we create more value for business. As we create value for business, we're creating value for society, and we're quite deliberate about the way that works. And in fact, in that strategy, the way we think about it is to look at those issues: economic opportunity, sustainable supply chains, healthy local communities, and say, well, what is the strategy that's going to maximize that shared value? Typically, it involves working with many others to rewire the system surrounding those issues. So we'll talk about workforce today, but in sustainable supply chains, there are many systems: sustainable produce, climate change, waste, deforestation, and so on. And working with others, leverage both our business assets and our philanthropy to accelerate improvements in those systems. So the business value is longer-term health of the surrounding systems we rely on, and the societal value, obviously, is healthier economic and social systems. So, we very much believe that market forces, environment, social factors, you can't separate these, if ever you could. Externalities get priced in one way or another. And we're a very long-term oriented company. So the decisions we're making in the short term certainly do come back and affect in the long term. And so we look at things that way. So our agenda around shared value starts with our business and serving our customers. But then, as I said, there are 3 aspects of how we operate that are a big part of it. I'm going to talk today just about this first one, which is economic opportunity, specifically through jobs. We also do a lot of work around our purchase order as a source of development capital. But thinking about jobs. So, retail ought to be an incredible starting place and ladder of opportunity for people in the jobs economy in this country and around the world. It's become one of the largest employment sectors in the economy. You look at some of the stats here. Retail directly and things related to retail are supporting about 25% of the jobs in the U.S., contributes massively to GDP, continues to grow. And, there's a lot of talk about e-commerce. So that's a big part of our business. Turns out that most of the top retail businesses online actually are brick and mortar players as well, right? So this notion of omni-channel retail is important. So the question then is, okay, so what are these ladders of opportunity? Because a characteristic of retail as a sector is it has a disproportionately large share of jobs at the entry level. Right? So if you go to a Walmart Supercenter, for example, we have a lot of entry-level roles that don't require a huge amount of skill to start. So, okay, that's a particular role that retail can play in the jobs economy. It offers that entree into work. It helps people come in and attach to work, even if they start with less skill. The question is, what happens to them after that? Do they stay there forever? Most people can't have a big, huge family at a very entry-level job. That's not, so where do you go? And what we're showing here is the jobs ladder, just illustratively, right, from kind of a frontline associate up to store manager. The problem is retail as a sector has a very high turnover of those entry-level jobs, 60%. So people aren't coming in, attaching and moving up. They're coming in and spinning out and coming in and spinning out. Maybe they're moving from place to place. And that's the problem we're trying to solve at Walmart through our business and through philanthropy. And we're trying to go beyond just creating a ladder in the retail sector. We're trying to really create a lattice of opportunity so that people could come in, get skills on the job, and then connect to other opportunities in adjacent sectors. So how do you do that? We think a huge part of it is skill acquisition of incumbent workers and making that as easy as possible and providing some form of credential so people who develop those skills can show it and employers would recognize that, right? So for so long as a society, we've relied on the 4-year degree. You need a bachelor's for this job. Why? It's just kind of an easy proxy for a bunch of skills that we don't know how to credential otherwise. We're trying to break that down. There's got to be different ways to badge people, show what they've earned. And let's give people credentials for the skill however they acquired it. Maybe they got it through being 20 years as a cashier or a store manager. That's worth something. So let's make it worth something. And that's something we've been focused on. So if I talk about Walmart then, just as an example, a Walmart store manager on average makes $170,000 a year. That is a very good job. So how do we help people coming and move up to that? 3/4 of our store managers actually started as hourlies. Doug McMillan, our CEO, started as an hourly in the warehouses. So, okay, how do we make that 100%? And by the way, this is not the experience of everybody. So while 75% of our managers started as hourlies, I don't think I can tell you 75% of people who start as hourlies become store managers, right? How do we make that happen? So we're focused on how do we upskill and promote within the company, but get every employer to be focused on upskilling so that there's more fluidity and upward mobility across the sector as a whole. So for Walmart, we spent about a year developing our strategy back in 2014. And we launched it in February of 2015. And there's a part within the company and there's a part through the Walmart Foundation that's sector-wide. So within the company, we said, okay, there's 2 things we need to do: stability and mobility. We need the stability because we can't have people churning in and out. They got to stick there long enough to get the skills to move up. So we did a few different things. So one is we did look at the wage structure. And we took the wages from what was, kind of a mix around the country of different starting levels, some kind of just above minimum wage. And so, okay, let's take everybody up to at least $11 an hour as a start. And it still varies depending on local jurisdictions, but as a starting point, let's make it a little bit higher to help give a bit stability. And then we looked at the benefits that we had. We've offered healthcare for a long time. It's available for part-time and full-time associates, very affordable, good coverage, and you can see all the other things here. The one I want to call out is PTO. This was more recent. In the last year, we took a look at paid time off for maternity and paternity, and we equalized it with our salaried employees. So an hourly person at Walmart has the same maternity leave that I would. So 10 weeks fully paid leave for maternity, plus an additional 6 weeks for parental. So that's 16 weeks of paid leave for a new birth mom. And then we gave 6 weeks paid leave for an adoptive parent, a father, any parent. So that's a generous package, for entry-level people, but it's important because people have families, right? So we're trying to help folks, again, that idea of stability, and then a bunch of other things here. You can see profit sharing and scheduling changes and so on that I can go into later. So there are a couple of other innovations we're experimenting with. One is an app around financial cash flow management. It's called Even. It helps people dip into wages that they've earned but haven't been coming to them yet in the paycheck. You've got that kind of couple-week gap typically. So it helps them manage their cash flow and helps get them a sense of how much they can afford to spend in any week. That's been a huge assist for stability. The studies, and I think it was JPMorgan, Diana Farrell, did a study around, the typical American has $400 only as emergency cash reserves on average. So Lots of people have less than that. So this is something we've been experimenting with to try to come over that. But mobility. Okay, so that's stability. For mobility, we said, all right, we've got to find a way for people to get skills on the job. How do we make it easier? So we've invested $2.7 billion in a combination of that starting wage increase and the training. An introductory program called Pathways that everybody goes through, first 90 days, and then something called Walmart Academy. So we have a couple hundred of these across the country. They're within a 1-hour drive of every associate. And it's advanced training. It's specialist training, produce department, electronics department, managerial training. This is what gives people the skills that allow them to move up the ladder that I showed. We've had about 320,000 people graduate from the academies since we started them about 18 months ago. 325,000 people. If you kind of equate that to university, that's a lot of students. And I mentioned the pathways, which everybody goes through. These are fundamental skills that, again, help people stick. It actually helps stability as much as mobility. And then the most recent thing we announced is access to higher education. So I talked about not wanting to fall back on the 4-year degree always as the marker of skill. However, there's a lot that you learn in a 4-year degree. So we've made education available to all of our associates in a new program that we started with Guild. It's a platform that curates relationships between employers and universities. We picked 3 that have a strong track record of success with incumbent adult workers. So you may have never heard of Brandman and Bellevue unless you're in the education space, but if you're in the education space, you probably know them. Good success rates about sticking with completing degree programs and placing in higher jobs. $1 a day for any associate. That's how much they pay. We cover everything else, the tuition, the books, everything. It is distance learning, so you can do it anywhere in the country. And the 2 degrees that we're supporting are retail management and supply chain management. And we provide people coaching and navigation support through Guild to stick with it and complete. We are tracking completion. And Lumina Foundation is going to do a study of us outside in. We're not paying them. This is part of their work to see. They've been tracking a few different companies doing things like this to get the evidence base about what works and what doesn't. They will feed back to us what's working and what's not so we can tweak this as we go. Since we announced this in June, we've had 40,000 people sign up. We're excited about that. Oh, and I forgot to say, the most exciting thing, we worked with the universities to translate people's work into credits. So right out of the gate, Walmart associates in aggregate have $250 million of college credit on their transcripts because they worked for 5 years as a produce manager or 6 years as somebody in the logistics part. So it's real. Like it was a pretty tight bar. They looked and had to pass a test around what skills can we show from that experience. And it's just an example of, providing that. Through the foundation, then, we launched a program the same day we launched the internal one in 2015, and it's working across the retail sector to make skills-based practices the norm. I won't go into detail about it now. Maybe we'll get into it in the discussion, but we've worked with, folks here and many, many others, dozens of grantees around the country, education providers, workforce boards, folks like National Skills Coalition, National Retail Federation, to try to get this career path mapped out, understand the skills, and innovate the kinds of training that incumbent workers have access to. So this is just a little summary of what I just talked about. And I'll just say one last thing, which is future of work. There's been a lot writing about this, new technologies, new jobs, what's going to happen. We're seeing it already. And so what we're excited about is this infrastructure we're putting in place for upskilling of incumbent workers is a flexible infrastructure. They're pipes. We can put anything through it. So we can teach technology. We can teach coding. We can teach, pharmacy tech. Like whatever the new jobs are going to be, we can put that through this infrastructure. And that's been quite deliberate so that we'll have a more flexible approach to upskilling. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Chris?
All right. I'll borrow this from you. So, Chris Winton, and, at FedEx, we believe that when you put people first, they'll deliver an awesome service, and then that service is what generates and makes us profitable. Then we take the profit, reinvest it back into the people, and that's the culture and DNA that we operate by. So what I want to focus on today is now how do we connect people and possibilities And I'll start with my own personal story. I grew up in an underserved community in the city of Memphis. 2 baby boomer parents, blue collar. They worked 2 jobs while I was growing up. And I heard that story, all of my life. Go to school, make good grades, go to college so you can get a good job with good benefits. And that's the American way. Well, the reality was in high school, I was a C student. And no one ever asked why I made C's. Well, no one asked because I was working 2 jobs and helping to pay bills at home. So I wasn't afforded the opportunity to study every night because I worked every night. But I was committed to saying, well, I got to take a different pathway to this American dream. But fortunately for me, my senior year in high school, I had a work permit to leave school early. And as I was leaving this day, the guidance counselor stopped me and said, Chris, there's a program by the name of Inroads who's here, and I want you to hear this speech. So I went in, sat in, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, I have to be at work, so hopefully this goes pretty quickly. And they go on to talk about intern opportunities and creating pathways for diverse young leaders to enter into corporate leadership. And so I was like, okay, I get it. Then they said, well, you had to have a 3.0 GPA. So I got up and started to walk out because I said, clearly this is not me. Well, that representative from Inroads came out, stopped me in the hallway and said, wait a minute, before you leave, let me talk to you. And then they started to learn about my story and the fact that I was working and paying bills and balancing grades all in high school. And they said, we want to give you a shot. Inroads went on to teach me the principles of how to work in corporate America, leadership, teamwork, communication, and then gave me an internship with a company that was my sponsor, and that sponsor was FedEx. So I started FedEx as an IT intern through Inroads, and then, of course, 17 years in the field of IT with FedEx, and then ultimately switching over to HR in my current role as vice president. And I start with that story simply to say that it took the education system, the nonprofit to reach out and connect, and then the private sector to reach in and sponsor, and that created and connected me with the possibility of being here today. And when I stepped into this role about 2 or 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to attend the Tech Hire Summit in Baltimore, where there were young minorities and individuals from underserved communities who were participating in FIRST Robotics. And I walked up and was seeing some of the robots that had been created, and there were 2 young gentlemen having a conversation about their robot being able to toss a ball 7 feet into a bucket. And one of them, his robot was tossing it past the bucket. And then I walked up on the conversation, and the conversation went something like, yeah, your diagram and your metrics on the flux capacitor is off, and that was my interpretation. And he said, pull up your code, let's work on your code. I fixed that problem. And I said, wait a minute, how old are you? One of them said, I'm 14, the other said, I'm 15. And I started to realize something at that moment, that there are skills being generated. And when you look at the 5 generations in the workplace today and the trajectory, I represent Gen X. I had to go to college to learn the skill of IT. But your millennials and Gen Z are growing up with this technology, even in underserved communities, and they have employable skills at a very early age. So now how do we capitalize on that opportunity when you start to look at the trajectory of the labor force, the unemployment rate, and the labor participation rate? And so we started to step back and look at it and said, all right, if we look at the unemployment rate and what's happening today, who's sitting outside? And that's when the focus on opportunity youth became one where we said, man, this is an opportunity. So just stepping back a bit, FedEx committed to investing $200 million in more than 200 global communities by 2020. And you can see our focus on the giving pillars, but I want to focus in on the one that we're talking about today, and that's employment pathways. How do we be purposeful about creating these pathways? So we started with a couple of pilot organizations to go, all right, can we put together a purposeful pathway and make a difference both in the community and be a win for FedEx as well? So lasering in, we started with a program called Basecamp Coding Academy in Water Valley, Mississippi. And if you're wondering where Water Valley, Mississippi is, so was I. But phenomenal story here of an organization, nonprofit, who was working with schools and looking for those students who may have had that tough first year or growing up in underserved communities, but these kids had grit. And they said, all right, we're going to take them right out of high school. They were not able to go right into college, but we're going to teach them the skill of coding. And then we'll also work with them to give them those soft skills, those interpersonal skills, so that they're workforce ready when they come out of this program. Well, this is the first graduating class out of Basecamp, and what we did was change the degree requirement so that our developer job no longer requires a degree, but a skill set from a coding boot camp, and then we offered these individuals jobs. And so then we said, well, wait a minute, they're right out of high school, a year into it. Let's work with some of our other nonprofits, such as Dress for Success, to make sure that they're ready to enter the workforce and have that confidence and the clothes to wear so that they feel like they integrate successfully. Then it was the mentorship. So actively, we have 6 of these individuals who we extended offers to. The others had a preference of staying locally into their area, and we're excited at the success that they're bringing to the company to this day. Also, too, we started to look at that first robotics competition and said, well, wait a minute, why don't we set up and invest into what's happening here? So all of the shipping of the robots nationwide is done by FedEx through our giving strategy, but we also set up recruitment booths at the competitions, and we made our first hire this year that's featured on our blog literally now, and Will is now a software developer at FedEx, and we're excited at the career growth and career path he has. And what we're finding out is interesting is both Will and our Basecamp graduates are now talking about using benefits such as tuition reimbursement to further their education. See, they just needed an opportunity to be able to work and go to school at the same time, because that's what was needed so that they can continue to help their families and their communities. So we're excited about giving those type of opportunities and pathways and what these individuals will do for us into the future. But we're not leaving out, the college graduate. Those positions are still key and critical, especially when you start to talk about fields such as data science and cyber experts. So we partner with the University of Memphis here and said, all right, how do we start to create these working opportunities for you to get skills on the jobs while you're going through college? And so at the University of Memphis, we actually have our help desk running by the University of Memphis and those students. So if an individual at FedEx is having problems logging into email and they make the phone call to the help desk, that's actually a University of Memphis student that's helping them and walking them through how to fix that. So now you get the skills and the about the field, and we can give you that clear pipeline into the jobs, and then we start to work with you on that career growth as you become a part of the FedEx family. And so that really sums up to really who we are, because it's not only important that we create the pathway, have the mentorship, have the relationships with all of the organizations to make that true so that we all become vital links in the chain, but we also feel it's equally as important to share the stories, So if you go out to imfedex.com, you will see the stories of all our people sharing how we put people first, then the service, then the profit, and that's what makes us valuable today. So with that, I'll turn it over
to JPMorgan Chase.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we at JPMorgan Chase like to use a lot of words on slides, so brace yourself because some of this font may be tight. It's something that I learned when I joined the firm. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I will do my best, one, to make sure that we can prime your questions and get ready for the discussion, but also to try to tie some of these themes together. So I'm going to take this briefly in three parts. One, just a quick overview of how we think about recruiting top talent and making it being an employer of choice. Secondly, really thinking about more broad, zooming out, thinking about some of the structural challenges and how do we address some of these questions of pathways and pipelines and leverage some of our philanthropic capital in that regard. And then how do we really scale the impact? Because while we have 250,000 employees globally, and if you put our companies together, you're starting to get into real big numbers. But if we do things in silos, we can't have the same impact if we all work together. And so this notion of scale and collaboration, I think, are really important. So I'm going to give you just a quick summary because, again, I know these words are small. But I think when you think about what entry-level employees look like in a bank, it's really, you think of the teller. But we also have call center employees. And it's oftentimes, when you look in our organization, it is not at all uncommon for people to say, I've been here for 20 years, I've been here for 30 years or 40 years. And it's funny, I remember in high school, the commencement speaker told us, you will have in your careers actually five to seven different careers. And I thought, that doesn't make sense. I'm going to go and get a job and stay there forever. And I didn't really understand what I meant. Now, it turns out the idea of going and staying in a company for your entire career seems foreign. I mean, especially for those of you who are relatively new into the workforce, that seems a little bit foreign. JPMorgan Chase, though, really focuses on these opportunities to develop talent throughout the career, from the moment that we recruit you, ultimately towards retirement. And so that's sort of baked in. And we also think about our culture as performance-based. So once we get you in the door, we tie our performance and ultimately our compensation into three key points. Of course, our earnings was this morning, so it was a good morning for us. But we think about the overall performance of the company. We think about the performance of the line of business, and we of course focus in on the performance of the individual. And I think one of the things that our CEO and chairman, Jamie Dimon, talks about all the time and it really pushes throughout our culture, no matter where you are, is that think of yourself as owners of this company. It's not just your job. It's not just thinking about what you are in your little box. It's actually thinking about how do you make sure that the thing that falls between the two of us, that actually somebody is willing to go outside of their line to make sure that things don't fall between the cracks. And I think as a highly regulated industry, and one who has had our own share of issues in the past, really focusing on this and not pretending that we're perfect, because we're certainly not, is really important. I think that notion is really something that we look for when we recruit talent, the willingness to reach across borders. So I think when you put it all together, of course, being part of a large company can be really beneficial, because we can offer benefits packages that are very competitive, and those competitors that may not have the same scale or scope that we do wouldn't be able to offer on-site wellness facilities, for example, a variety of tuition benefit programs. Ours actually don't have any restrictions in terms of where you want to go, so long as it's an accredited academic institution. And it's not just based on achieving a particular type of credential. Actually, you can receive up to $7,000 on an annual basis for the entirety of your career. If you want to keep going to school, like some people do, then you can. And so that's something that we're really proud of. And we try to also give people the space to do that. And that even applies to people that are part-time workers, so long as they meet about 30 hours on average from a weekly basis. When you put all those benefits together, that's about, particularly for your entry-level employee, that's about a $12,000 a year. Putting the tuition reimbursement aside, it's about $12,000 a year. That is not an immaterial benefit. I think I'd also point out that there's a lot of conversation these days about high deductible medical plans, and the way that we structure our plans is we also offer all employees the ability to have a medical reimbursement account. And if you participate in certain wellness activities, you can get up to $1,200 a year. And so for our certain medical plans, that can cover the entirety of your contribution. So if you think about being an entry-level employee, a branch employee in some cases, you can have the entirety of your medical covered. And then we do things like we cover all preventative checkups, for example. And really focus in on how do we make sure that our overall population is focused on wellness. And so when you really peel back kind of how these things put together, you really can figure out how do you not only sit in the job today, but how do you develop that pathway as a long-term career, from a long-term career perspective. From a skills and training perspective, we invest an incredible amount of money, but it's not just about how much money we put into it, it's about does it work or not. Because I think that's a key point. Now, we are a highly regulated business, of course. And so when you look at some of these big numbers, 11 million hours of training for our workforce globally, which is just a little bit more than 250,000 employees, the vast majority of which are here within the United States. That's a lot of training. And it comes at all different levels, right? So some of it's online, some of it's in person. There's leadership development. But one of the things that we try to do also is give perspective. So, for example, for what we call top talent at the sort of the mid to junior level, we also embed things like part of our cultural elements. So, how do we show up in community? We do a virtual service corps where we bring nonprofits in and we help determine what are some key challenges facing that particular nonprofit. And we get this cross-divisional group of experts and say, you guys, the talent in this room is amazing. You guys help the nonprofit figure out how to solve its benefits program. How do we think about how they should develop their own talent and recruitment program? How do we help them think about what their accounts payable processing looks like? What's their marketing strategy? And that's been incredibly successful. And tying our employees at all levels across the firm to programs like that helps make sure that it's a place where people want to not only come, but come and stay. I also think that we're really proud of the ways in which we recruit talent as just a general matter. So half of our employees are female. I think importantly, 48% of our U.S. population, which is about 171,000 people, are ethnically diverse. That's really important to us because we think that diverse teams people with different backgrounds and different perspectives come up with better solutions at the end of the day. We also think it's important to show up in the neighborhoods and in the places where we have footprint and make sure that we're working with people in those communities to give jobs, to give opportunities, and to make sure that there's a way to connect. For example, if there's deficiencies in certain neighborhoods, we have really sophisticated programs to make sure that there's connection to build pathways so there's a chance to access that economic ladder of opportunity. So I think we try to also take, from a zooming out perspective, try to take some proactive steps. We are really focused. We don't need legislators or regulators to help tell us how we should think about recruiting our talent. And so that we've done 2 times in the last 2 years, we have proactively raised our own minimum wage. And so over the course of that 2 years, we've gone from a baseline, depending on geography, of just over $10 to a baseline of $15. I mean, that is a 50% increase for some of these entry-level employees. I think there's no question in these areas we're going above and beyond sort of this whole concept and debate around what a living wage might be. And then when you combine that with the benefits package and the training opportunities, and I would note that frequently when folks walk in the door, particularly in the branch employees, they go through several weeks of training before they even start on day one. And giving them that access to the training, particularly for somebody who has not had an opportunity to be in the workforce previously, I think we focus a lot, and we hear Jamie in his comments say this a lot, it's about, in many ways, the dignity of work. You've got to give people a purpose and a place to go and the ability to have pride in being able to support themselves and support their families. And so we really focus on that. I would also call out that following the passage of tax reform earlier this year, we thought about how is the firm going to show up in this conversation and this debate. And rather than thinking about, what is a short-term thing we can put in our press release, we thought about what are the long-term ways in which we can reinvest in our employees, in our communities, and in our business. And so what we did, we once again raised the minimum wage, again, between, and I'll look if I can squint my eyes, between $15 and $18 an hour. And if you think about that, depending on what your market is, that's a pretty significant, for a first job, that's a pretty significant amount. We also are expanding our business footprint. So even here in the Washington, D.C. area, we are, for the first time, going to have retail branches later this year. We're hiring hundreds of people. We have made commitments both from a lending perspective on an individual basis and from a small business perspective to get more capital into the hands of people who need it. And we're also thinking about how do we expand our philanthropic commitment. And so we've committed on an annual basis an incremental $100 million, which takes us up to about $350 million on an annual basis of philanthropic investments. And so bridging that, one of the elements, our entire mission when we think about philanthropy is this whole notion of inclusive growth. And I know Kathleen talked a lot about economic opportunity. I think of these things as really sort of two sides of the same coin. And one of the pillars of our approach here, our model for impact, which I show this to you, I'm not going to go into great detail, though I'm happy to answer any questions. But this graphic is intended to demonstrate the rigor and the seriousness by which we approach our investments in community. Because we think that business also has a role to play when it comes to solving some broad societal challenges. And we think that, we don't need somebody to tell us to go and figure it out. We think it's our obligation and it's our responsibility. It's a responsibility to our employees in the communities that they live, but it's also a responsibility to our customers, our clients, and frankly, as citizens and in the countries in which we exist. So focusing in on the jobs and skills pillar, this is an area in which we've spent tremendous focus. Over the past 5 years, just in this pillar alone, we've invested over $350 million. Some of our signature programs are New Skills for Work, New Skills at Youth. And again, it's what we're focused on is how do you help the employment side of the equation build opportunities for the jobs that exist, to make sure that they can go find people with the skills that they need. And so there's constantly this mismatch between jobs without people and people without jobs. And so how do you bring those things closer together, and how do you do it in an efficient way? This is something that's really hard to do at scale. So but going to my last point, which is sort of how do you think about scale and collaboration? There's a lot of different ways to do this. Certainly working with our grantees and our nonprofits and other partners across the business community is one way to do that. I'll call out in particular, Jamie, our chairman, is chairman of the Business Roundtable, which is both of my colleagues here on the panel are active participants in that group. And just recently, what we've done is launched a group called the Workforce Partnership Initiative. And what we've done is we've looked at pilot regions throughout the country, and we've said, look, instead of trying to create just the JPMorgan training program or just the FedEx program, how do we figure out how to work together with education providers of all different levels? How do you get the business community together? How do you get workforce development boards? And how do you get in the same room? And how do you figure out what are the jobs not only of today, but Kathleen, to your point earlier, what are the jobs of the future? And when you think about how we layer on this whole conversation of the future of work, it gets to be really complicated. And I will say that if we as a business community are not proactive about how do we think about not only what the jobs of tomorrow are going to look like, but what are we going to do with our current employees whose skills may have to dramatically change over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. We got to get out ahead of that. So we're really focused on that, and we're really committed to making sure that that the firm is not only a leader, but that we together and working together can have a bigger impact and be more efficient at getting more people through that funnel.
Okay. Michael, to provide a sort of broader context.
So Robert asked me to provide some broader context on wages, and he also asked me to do it quickly. I
have lots of questions.
Robert's got lots of questions, and this morning Robert told me that he thought I had too many slides to do it quickly. So we'll see.
I withdraw all those comments. You do whatever you want, Michael.
So we'll see how this goes. But I don't want to take up too much time because I want to keep the focus on some things that these companies are doing on the front lines to affect the broader macroeconomic trends that I will briefly discuss. So some thoughts on wages. This is a chart of wage growth, and it goes back a pretty long time just to show how different macroeconomic regimes affect wage growth. These are wages for kind of typical workers, workers who aren't managers, who are kind of production workers without a supervisory role. And you see before the mid 1980s that it was typical to have wages growing 6, 7, 8, 9% per year. That was in a different inflationary regime. And then, of course, wage growth went down as overall prices went down. And we kind of have gotten used to thinking about wages as growing in the 3 to 4% range in a healthy economy. And one of the issues that has confronted policymakers and that a lot of people have been thinking about is why is it that since the Great Recession ended, we are seeing wages growing in the 2 to 2.5% range, and that's really a major issue and a subject of a lot of discussion. And of course, it affects the real lives of workers in a very direct way. This is one wage series. Of course, there are many different ways to measure wages, and the folks at Goldman Sachs have tried to aggregate those and do an index. I think this is interesting to look at because it is kind of more comprehensive, but it matches the conclusions that you would draw from the chart I just showed. That wages are kind of in the 2.5% range. That there's been some increase since around 2012. When you aggregate, you see that line is trending upward, which suggests that wage growth is accelerating, but it's certainly not accelerating at a breakneck pace. And if you see the kind of slope with which wages fell from before the Great Recession to around 2012, that we certainly haven't seen a commensurate acceleration following the recession and into the recovery. This is another way of showing the same thing, so I'll skip that. So what's going on? Given the current amount of labor market slack, the performance of wage growth is something of a mystery. What does that mean? In an economy with a lot of unemployed workers, firms don't have to raise wages as quickly or as aggressively in order to get the workers that they need, because there are a lot of workers who are chasing a relatively few number of jobs. This is a graph of two measures of unemployment. The red line is traditional unemployment, the unemployment rate that you read about in the newspaper, and you see that went up to about 10% during the recession and shortly thereafter, and that has just plummeted down to 4%, which is a really significant decline. The blue line is a broader measure of labor market resource underutilization. that includes workers who are working part-time but report wanting a full-time job, and that also includes some workers who are technically not unemployed because they've stopped looking for work but they would like to work, you see that line has really plummeted as well. And so the question is, if you have a situation where there are fewer and fewer unemployed workers and where every year there's significantly less unemployment in the economy than there was before, why is it that we don't see wages growing aggressively as employers attempt to not only attract relatively scarce workers, but retain the workers that they have who could be leaving for other jobs? There are other measures in addition to the unemployment rate that suggest that the labor market is very healthy, which only reinforces this mystery. These are two of those. The red line is the job openings rate, the rate at which companies are posting new jobs, creating vacancies. And the blue line is the rate at which workers are quitting their jobs. And the kind of thought is that a worker would not quit his or her job unless the worker thought that not only could they get a better job, not only could they get another job, but they could get a better job. They wouldn't voluntarily quit unless they were relatively confident that they would fare well after having done so. And you see that both of those measures are higher than they were before the Great Recession. So the rate at which the economy is creating jobs and a measure of the confidence of workers in the labor market are actually higher than they were before the recession started. And again, if there are more job openings out there, then you would expect that businesses would feel more pressure to accelerate wage growth in order to retain workers who might be looking at outside opportunities and in order to attract workers who want to come into the workforce. So that raises the question. So that sets up the mystery, right? On the one hand, you see these indicators that suggest that there's not a lot of slack, but you don't see a lot of wage growth. So some people have speculated that there's hidden slack, and Robert mentioned this in his introductory remarks. This is the rate of employment as opposed to the rate of unemployment. And it's simply, for every 100 people between the ages of 25 and 54, how many of them have a job? Why 25 and 54? Those are workers who, roughly speaking, are too old to be in school, roughly speaking, are too young to be retired, so people who are kind of in their prime working years. And you see that really took a hit during the Great Recession, and it has not recovered. You see that if you look kind of in the years right before that gray bar representing the Great Recession, you see that the employment rate was higher than it is now, even though it's been recovering impressively since it fell during the recession. This makes some people believe that the unemployment rate is not really a reasonable or a comprehensive indicator of labor market slack and labor market health, and it suggests that there's more slack in the labor market than the indicators that I've showed you suggest, which could explain why businesses don't feel pressure to aggressively increase their wage offerings. This is a compelling story. I think there's probably something to it. But, unfortunately, if you look back at the late 1990s and you try to draw a trend line, you see, and I should have drawn a trend line on here, but I did not. But you can see, if you just kind of eyeball it, that the employment rate is trending down for this group of workers. And even if you ignore the large drop from the Great Recession, if you just try and kind of connect the dots that represent the various peaks following the late 1990s, you see it's a downward trend, and it's not clear that the employment rate is below that downward trend. You might think that downward trend represents more factors that are related to the structure of the economy, factors that are related to the structure of American life, drug use, incarceration, the acquisition of skills, population changes, these sorts of slower moving changes. And if that's the case, then even the employment rate doesn't necessarily suggest that there's hidden slack in the labor market. So there's some other potential explanations. People have talked about compositional change. If you have a situation where older workers are retiring faster than younger workers are entering the labor market, then that could mechanically put downward pressure on wage growth because younger workers tend to be relatively less paid than older workers. There's been a lot of talk about the gig economy. If employers think that gig economy workers represent kind of a pool of resources they could tap. If they raise their wages a little bit, then the gig economy could also be putting downward pressure on wage growth. It could be that businesses are offering other things besides wage increases. So there have been some reports in the press that businesses are less likely to require background checks on applications. This kind of broadens the pool of available workers and reduces the need to raise wages. There have been reports in the press about businesses offering signing bonuses that normally wouldn't do that. We know that bonus payments as a share of compensation for the macroeconomy as a whole have been going up. And so there are other ways, and the representatives of these companies here have talked about the non-wage benefits that they offer, and that's obviously important to them. And if you beef those up, then you're not technically raising wages according to many measures, but you are increasing compensation. It may be that businesses wanted to cut wages and needed to cut wages during the recession, but were unable to do so because nobody likes to have their nominal wage cut. And it could be that we're just kind of working through that backlog. It could be that people are not used to pay increases. If you think about people who entered the workforce during this time, if you graduated from college and got your first job in the year 2010, let's say, you've been in the workforce for a while now, but you've been in the workforce during an economy that is strengthening, but that hasn't been super strong. And maybe you've never gone into the boss's office and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I need a 10% raise, or I'm leaving." And maybe you don't know anybody who's done that. And it could be that because the recovery from the recession has taken so long and has been painful and uneven, that norms within companies have changed about asking for wage growth, and that the culture inside company has changed. It may also affect employers. Employers may just be used to giving something like a cost of living increase, or maybe a little bit more. And it has been so long since they had to deal with other factors that they're not offering the kind of wage increases that they otherwise would. And finally, and maybe most importantly, productivity. Wages grow. Roughly speaking, wages grow when productivity grows and when price inflation increases. And we have had quite low productivity growth this cycle. And if you actually just take productivity growth and add the rate of inflation to it, you don't get something that's that far away from the wage growth that we're seeing. Now, of course, there are all sorts of issues with measuring productivity, and measuring wages is more complicated than it sounds. But that's surely part of the story. So that's it. I've skipped one slide.
Okay.
So I kept my promise to you that I wouldn't do all the slides. So what about some subgroups? This section was specifically requested by Robert that I talk about some subgroups, which I will do quickly. So these are wage growth by different workers that are aggregated according to skill levels. So you see low-skill workers, mid-skill workers, and high-skill workers, and then overall wage growth. And what I think is interesting about this chart is that although low-skill workers are seeing their wages growing less rapidly and took a bigger hit after the recession, you see that the rate at which their wages are growing, at least from 2013 to 2016, 2017, is actually significantly faster than the rate at which other skill groups' wages are growing. So if you're particularly interested in lesser skilled Americans, or of course if you're a company that employs a large number of workers who aren't college graduates, then that's something that's interesting perhaps. This is a similar chart that I'm going to skip, and I will conclude on perhaps some good news. If you ask businesses, do you plan to raise worker compensation, the rate at which they're saying yes is going up. And it's well above the pre-crisis levels. So it could be that happy times are here again. And I skipped two slides. And I will not stop.
So I have 3 questions for each of the corporate representatives.
None for me?
And then I'll have one for you as well.
That tells you how you feel
want
about
to
it,
get off
right?
to this good start on. So Kathleen, you talked about a really big change at Walmart starting about 2014. Big investments, wage increases, greater focus on skills, the training academies. Have there been costs to those investments from an investor standpoint or from a customer standpoint? And how have you handled that? That's one question. And then while you're doing that, I also want you to address the issue of, I was very fascinated by your chart that you were training people for advancement that may not be in Walmart. So I want you to just address the non-compete issue and non-poaching issue, and how does Walmart view that?
Sure. Yeah. So yes, as I mentioned, we've invested about $2.7 billion in the wage increases and training programs, and that's not counting our most recent wage increase. So we've done 3 wage increases since 2015. Back to your slide. So I guess we're part of that movement. So the year that we did the first round of wage investments and announced the investments in training and so on, our stock fell 30%. So we knew it was the right thing to do for long-term value creation, that we were going to see clear benefits, obviously, for our associates, but for our business as well, in terms of retention, customer service, availability, and so on. And that was one of the major factors for us doing all of this, was recognizing that we're in a period of heightened competition, especially as we go through our transformation from a pure bricks and mortar retailer to an omni-channel, e-commerce player. So we have made significant investments to do this, and they're investments that we believe have a strong ROI, and we're actually seeing benefits for our business as well as our associates.
And Chris, you told me before we came in the room that you're having trouble finding workers or drivers or people in your, and I guess I just want to ask you directly, is one of your methods of, could you quantify that a little bit, and also is one of FedEx's methods to solve that problem raising wages?
Sure, yeah. So, we are over 400,000 employees worldwide. And obviously, during our peak season, we really ramp up heavily in positions such as package handlers. So what we're finding, though, is with that seasonal type workforce, how do we create that stickiness to say, I may start here as a package handler at this wage, but the opportunities are endless, and really now creating that purposeful pathway to get there. So while we invest into increasing that wage, we are actually focused on our leadership teams and training our leaders to go, well, let me stop for a minute. I didn't just hire you to be a package handler. I hired you as an investment into FedEx's future. But what are your personal goals? And now let's start working on coaching from that personal goal to the opportunities that we have both today and into the future. And let's create that pathway to those positions that do pay higher, and we keep that talent within.
So, Chris, just to push that a little bit, are you indicating that maybe you're not adjusting the wage as much as you're focusing more on advancement and retention and benefit packages? And are workers responding positively to that?
Actually, it's a parallel effort, and I would say yes. I mean, the response is higher there when people realize that there are growth opportunities. Especially when we start to talk about millennial and Gen Z. It's all about what is the growth opportunity, and is this somewhere that's going to be focused in me and pulling me forward?
And can I just add,
go ahead?
Just to add on that, going to your second question, one of the reasons that we're investing so much in upskilling our folks, whether they stay with us or not, is we think it'll help us attract people to us who are interested in that growth opportunity. Yes. Some people may stay with us and want to be store managers, and people may also view it as a springboard to opportunities elsewhere, so that's quite deliberate. We also believe that the sector as a whole needs to improve skill development, and that will create a stronger talent base in retail and service sector writ large. one of the studies that we funded through the Walmart Foundation work with the National Skills Coalition took a look at 50 million service sector employees, so early stage employees in service sector jobs. And what they found was that 2/3 of that population has fundamental literacy gaps, and 3/4 have fundamental numeracy gaps. So that's the state of the broad talent pool. So it's very much part of our strategy to elevate the sector as a whole, because we think that'll benefit everyone.
And Amanda, this is a question I want you to address, and then I want Michael to address it broadly, if it's possible. Maybe it's not. But you were the only one that specifically mentioned the tax bill and the corporate tax reduction that resulted in that legislation. And I wondered, is JPMorgan Chase able to quantify the benefits of that legislation to their firm and where the benefits went, employers versus customers versus investors? Is that, I used to work for a bank president who used to say we have three constituencies in the bank, employees, customers, and investors. With the proceeds of the tax bill, do you have a sense of where it went on those three constituencies?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would also say at this point, I feel like it's a little too soon to tell. Right? We made, in January, we made a $20 billion commitment comprised of the factors that I discussed. But we're still recruiting talent, even in this area, to support our branch commitment, to support the increased lending commitments that we've made. So this is going to be something that's not just, the bill passes early in the year, and then we see, we appreciate and enjoy the full benefits in July. I think what we're focused on and how we thought about, though, our commitments is how do you make sure that, again, it wasn't just a one-time infusion, and in particular from a worker perspective. We wanted to make sure that this was an opportunity for an ongoing ability to not only raise wages but give it incremental opportunities for skills training and from a philanthropic standpoint as a way to help address some of these very, very significant systems changes that we face as a society.
Michael, can you quantify, how will we know whether workers got a benefit from the tax cut?
That's hard to quantify. I think my expectation is that the tax cut will increase wages in the following way. By making investment more profitable, businesses will be incentivized to invest. Increased investment will make workers more productive. And if workers are more productive, then they will earn higher wages. That story takes some time to happen. That does not happen in 6 months. It certainly does not happen in 3 months. That will take a few years in order to work its way through the economy, and likely take a few years to show up in any sort of wage statistics. The conversation around the benefits of the tax cut to workers has been very confused. There have been a lot of people concerned about how corporations are using their immediate tax savings and whether or not that immediate tax savings is showing up in wages or showing up in going to the owners of the company through other means. That fundamentally confuses the issue. That's not the people who wanted to see the corporate tax rate come down never thought that cutting the corporate tax rate would create a pool of money in the year that the tax cut was passed that could then be allocated to workers. That was never the idea. The idea was always the more medium and long term investment, productivity, wages story that I told. And of course, both sides are to blame because Republicans did a lot of exaggerating about the kind of immediate effects that we would see from the tax cut as well. But the basic economic story that if you if you incentivize investment, you'll get more investment, and if you have more investment, you'll have more productive workers, and if you have more productive workers, those workers will command higher wages in a competitive labor market is one that is, for the most part, correct.
Do all three of you agree that this issue about credentials needs to change and people being able to get a credential that may be short of a 4-year bachelor's degree but allows them to justify their employment by a future employer? I mean, can we have a little conversation about how we hire people who don't necessarily have a 4-year degree?
We very much agree with that, and that's a big part of our strategy. So through the Walmart Foundation, we've been trying to do 3 things across the sector. So one is just generate awareness of the benefits to business as well as workers of upskilling and advancement through work. And some of the research I mentioned, National Skills Coalition, we've mapped out career pathways and understanding practices that are proven with evidence to actually help people, employers, workforce boards, education providers, and so on do that. The second part has been around innovations in training, advancement, and credentialing. And so, yes, we think that it's important that people get hired into roles and have an opportunity to move into new roles based on the skills, what they know, what they can do, what they can deliver. And then there needs to be a marker for that. And as I said, traditionally, people have fallen back on the associate's degree or the bachelor's degree as those markers. We have never had those as requirements to enter work at Walmart. You can get a job in a store without those things. We've also done things like ban the box and so on to take away that as a disincentive, a decredential for folks to get work. But now what we're trying to do through our work within the company and then also the foundation programs is to create a stronger shared vision across employers and workforce boards and education providers nationally and in local communities. You talked about the BRT initiative. We've been doing something similar for a few years now in national level and local communities to say, okay, let's agree as different employers in a labor market around what are the skills needed for different kinds of jobs, and then what are the markers for those, and how do we both make it easier for people to earn those credentials but have them widely accepted. One example, we've been working with League of Innovation and the community college system in the Western United States to take an existing credential, which is Western Association of Grocers credential around produce management. It takes 2 years to earn. It's a great credential. It's widely used in the grocery industry, but 2 years to earn. And we took that, and we're breaking it down into bite-sized pieces that people can earn while they're working and get a benefit, get a promotion, get an advancement from having just different elements of that, and have that still be a widely recognized credential, but more attainable, more accessible. So it's very, very much something we believe in and agree with, and are trying to activate and make come to life in local labor markets as well as nationally.
Chris?
Yeah, I would definitely say absolutely. And now it's a matter of how do we scale that thinking. And I go back to IT because we often talk about the STEM shortage. And the reason that is because IT used to be a vertical career path. It truly is now a foundational horizontal to every job, including your entry-level blue-collar position on through accounting, finance. It's a horizontal skill, and it's a skill that's natural to many now. So how do you start to scale that? But what I think where we got to start really reaching deeper is educating all the way back into middle school, high school, and our educators to understand that these skills are already there. And now how do we further develop them and realize that these are careers that can be coached on? So career counseling early and understanding that these career paths exist in areas such as social media marketing, mobile app development, the things that our millennial, Gen Z, and people are doing every day are jobs that we're looking to hire in large numbers.
Yes.
On that, one of the grantees we've been supporting is Opportunity at Work. They're based here in D.C. They're doing great work exactly on this. So helping people earn an IT credential in a very short amount of time. What's innovative about many things, but one of the innovative things about their approach is they shifted the cost of that and the risk of getting that credential from the learner to the future employer. So if I'm the learner, I don't have to pay to do that. So I'm getting the skill, and the way that gets funded is the employer that needs somebody with that skill is willing to pay to recruit the right person. So it turns the risk model on its head, which is, another challenge, is the debt that is accumulated by students learning things that they're never going to get jobs to do, right? So it shifts that model. And that's one that we've been co-funding with Google.org. We were doing a few things with them, and they're very interested in this question of how do we drive tech skills, in the country into different roles.
Yeah.
Amanda?
Yeah, and I would just jump in and say that it also can, when you think about credentials, it can be really a very confusing space, both from an employer perspective and from an employee perspective. What matters? How do I, as a worker, get the job at FedEx? What are those credentials that are going to make me get the job? And so we've been supporting a program called Credential Engine, which is a database and an infrastructure which actually helps people understand not only here is the litany of credentials that are out there, but also trying to help zoom in and try to figure out here are the ones that are the most valuable, and particularly towards the pathway that I'm most interested in. And I think one of the other things that we've learned is that sometimes people need to understand there are people like me who could be in a job like that. And so it's how do you connect those real human interest stories through the actual credentialing behind them so people can understand that this is a pathway that isn't abstract, rather it's accessible to somebody like me, and I can figure out how to go and get there.
Well, what I would say, and there are probably a number of people in this room that are also working on these issues, that's why you're here most likely. We're also funders of Credential Engine, and I'd say it's, these things are at a stage now of we've gone from 1,000 flowers blooming to some organization in the garden, but we got a long way to go for true kind of like-minded shared vision. We're all working in the same ecosystem, and it's very fluid, but that's where we're trying to, absolutely where we're trying to get. And that's why at this stage of the evolution of workforce development and everything we're talking about, it's important to move from lots of pilots of the pieces of the ideas that need to happen to ecosystems in local labor markets where you've got the workforce board, the employers, the education providers, these new technology solutions and startups, and a lot of them are coming from civil society, at the same table, working together to rewire how the hiring's happening, how the promotion's happening, shared vision around the skills needed for promotions into different kinds of jobs. There are a handful of more organizing kind of organizations trying to do this sort of thing. So there's the BRT initiative. There's another group called Rework America Task Force, which has brought together these parties to try to do this. So Vanguard employers, education providers, folks in the community college system, the four-year degree system, newer education providers, exactly to try to make these ecosystems come together. And so I think the more that employers like us and these other providers are actually together at national tables and locally, making this happen, making it a reality for people in the way the local workforces function, we're starting to live into what's just going to become the norm for everybody.
Yeah, and if I could just add that, because I want to make sure, because we've went through an evolution when you start talking about credentials, it's not about getting that certificate or even that degree, because what we find as employers is if you just got the certificate but didn't obtain the education and skill, that actually starts to be worse. But actually getting the education, the skill, and the information is out there for everyone to grab. But that's why that local ecosystem of the workforce board, the education system, private sector working together locally gives you the networking opportunities to convey how you've gotten that skill. And when the unemployment right now is where it is, believe me, we're there looking for you.
Michael, do you have any concerns about this alternative credentialization and less emphasis on a four-year degree?
No, I think it's great.
Okay. All right. Let's look to the audience for some questions that we might have for our right there, Tamar. Well, wait for the microphone. We want you to wait for the microphone, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Vivian is on her way.
Hi, I'm Tamar Jacoby, Opportunity America. I have two questions. Can I ask two questions?
Yes.
Okay, so the first is, there's in the past, certainly, most training provided by employers went to more educated, more skilled, higher paid employees by dramatic margin. It wasn't a sort of almost a level playing field. It was a slalom course. Is that changing? And are you, how intentional are you being about that? And I sort of, obviously at Walmart you kind of are, but like to hear more about that. And the other question is, it's easy now. We're in a tight labor market. A lot of employers are thinking about this and thinking, what can they do to be attractive and help workers? What's going to happen when the labor market isn't so tight? Tax bill notwithstanding, it's not going to last forever.
Well, just on the tight labor market point, I think that, at some point that will probably happen, but in many sectors, certainly our own, the competitiveness with each other isn't going to change regardless of the labor market being tight or not. And so wanting to have highly skilled, engaged, productive people to serve the customer, to compete well, that's going to certainly remain important for us. In terms of the mix, so we've created sort of a lifelong learning platform for all of our people. So it starts with that entry level, the Pathways program, academies, and so on, and then it continues through our different jobs. And we're just going to keep building on that. So we will be investing in micro-credentials and other things for other kinds of paths, tech paths we've talked about a bunch. And for us, that investment in the front line has been very deliberate, and it has been the lion's share of our attention actually the last few years. It's now we're kind of rounding out with others and making it holistic. But it's important, as I said before, for business benefits to be able to compete as a company and serve the customers of today who have an expectation about an experience and a level of service. And it's obviously important for our people and being able to attract great talent and create that pipeline that does take people from that entry level all the way through to the senior positions.
Training for entry level or lower skilled?
Yeah, sure. And I think the question is valid. I mean, the tight labor market, I think, had each of us as large employers to step back and look. One of the things that we did was take and start looking at 3-year strategic workforce plans and says, what does the landscape look like? And to Michael's earlier point, when we start to see the baby boomer generation retiring in large numbers, and what do those future opportunities look like? And you look at the labor market, it starts to ask those questions of, does that job really require a degree? Or does it really require 10 years experience to do that when we know how the job is evolving? And we're looking at that across all sectors because each sector of the jobs, from a, like I said, cybersecurity professional to a pilot, are all opportunities. And let's be purposeful about creating pathways. And to that individual who's, like I said, a package handler, did you know you could be a pilot one day? Mm-hmm. Let's be purposeful about that.
Amanda, you want to comment on that? Okay.
I think that we very much have a similar perspective. I would also note, though, that when we've talked a lot about tellers, we also are an incredibly large technology organization ourselves. I mean, you think about the migration to a lot of banking on mobile, and so we think about looking at talent, and their choice can be, I want to go to work at Google or a startup or a large financial institution. And so we have to figure out how to make that case. And it's a really interesting one because there's big cultural differences around sort of a technology-centric organization and a financial institution. And then we have factors like being a highly regulated entity, and what does that mean, and what are the drivers, how does that affect what the required training is. And so, you mix all that together, and it's a really interesting moment as we think about what that long-term development is. But I also give a lot of credit to the way in which our leadership team is operationalizing this, because the notion of that you need to come and you need to be dressed up to the nines is sort of going away. And if you look in some of our large technology centers, it would be very hard for you to differentiate between that and some of your more traditional views on what a technology company environment is. It's a much less formal. We really focus on sort of coding camps and coding, bringing in sort of that connectivity to the communities. And so I think that it's changing rapidly, but we also, to your point, need to be very deliberate about how we get there. Because if you don't think 2 or 3 years out and you don't constantly come back and revisit that, you can end up in a place that you did not predict. And I think that can be quite dangerous.
I would just like to add that coming from the experience that I had as the commissioner of employment services programs and public benefit programs, or was working with people who were really struggling, who might have had limited skills or limited education or other difficulties, the importance of employers who would welcome them with training and wages and a pathway was vital. I mean, I want employers to recognize that for that population, the choice between having someone get an opportunity in an organization that will provide the skills and the training and the welcoming spot of a job and sending them to an employment program, or frankly a community college, is just much more valuable in the world that you are all in, because frankly people want to earn and learn at the same time. And I think it brings us back a little bit to, Kathleen, the way you started by indicating that American businesses have bigger responsibilities to the society as a whole than just their investors and their profit margin. And so I cannot reiterate more what Tamar was pointing out, that to the extent that training and opportunity is offered to those who are facing difficulties or have had trouble in their past or are of limited education, is so important, because I don't know where else they'll get it, where it will be as strong and effective, honestly. Okay, right there.
Hi, Richard Reeves from the Brookings Institution. There's a general sense in the panel that there's a difference between starting on low wages and staying on low wages, and this idea of progression. I think the words progression, pipelines, and pathways have all been used. Maybe some other words beginning with P as well. And so there's kind of clearly that sense, and I think we'd all agree with that instinctively. But recent work from the OECD suggests that actually in the US, the chances of being on the same rung of the earnings ladder 4 years later, to take point A and then measure again 4 years later, has actually risen over the last 20 years. So it looks as if the labour market as a whole might be actually a bit stickier. And it seems to me that the proof is really in the pudding. It's really in the data. And I guess I'm probably looking at you, Kathleen, because you employ 1 in every 100 US employees, or a bit more, actually. Yeah. So that's a pretty big sample, 1.5 million. What do any of you know about what your own internal labour markets are showing about internal upward progression? I've heard a lot about your schemes, and that all sounds fantastic. But do you know whether people are actually moving up over 4 years or 10 years, or are they stuck in place? Because the wage story is very different when you look at it cross-sectionally to when you look at it over the course of someone's career. So with 1.5 million, that's a good data set. What does it tell us?
Yeah, and that's exactly the challenge we're trying to solve. I haven't seen the stats you're referring to, but it wouldn't surprise me. And so that's the picture we're trying to change. I showed you the stat in retail that says turnover is 60% a year. That's probably evidence of that same phenomenon. So that's what we're trying to change, is to actually create the ladder and the links from that entry level up. We typically promote more than a few 100,000 people a year, but we think we can do better than that. I mean, that's exactly what we're focused on. So the Lumina Foundation, one of the things they'll be studying about us as a case study, and we're not the only employer they're looking at, they have several, will be exactly this. What's working, what's not, in terms of skill development, linking to progression, whether it's at Walmart or a next job somewhere else. And that's going to be a quite important set of findings. We also funded FSG, a consulting firm through the Walmart Foundation, to study the evidence base around practices employed by retailers driving promotions and advancement, what works, what doesn't, and retention. And so if you're interested in that, it's publicly available. It's a study they did. They worked with many employers and codified specific tactics, not just training, but other things. So supervisor coaching, some of the benefits we've talked about today, scheduling practices, and so on. And they analyze the evidence base in terms of degree of certainty or proof. So everything from truly, controls and pilots and statistics and showing true impact that you'd feel good about to anecdotal evidence. We tried this in Ohio, it seemed to work, right? And everything in between. And that's a pretty rich study. And so we're funding things like that so that people can take those insights, work it into their own practices, so that along with the advancement and so on, they're doing the other things that are going to be necessary for that stability and the mobility. And, as I said, I would characterize the field from going from lots of experiments to now trying to organize and learn what's working and do this in a more deliberate, strategic way.
Yes, sir. Right here in the front. And this may be the one more after this.
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So my name is Daniel DiMartino. I'm an intern at Economics 21, the Manhattan Institute. And we've talked a lot about education.
Did you say
and
the Manhattan Institute? Okay.
Yeah, the Manhattan Institute. So we've talked a lot about education and how this can help people progress in their careers and, of course, advance within your own companies, and I think that's great. But also in the tax bill, there's this full expensing of equipment. And productivity, as Michael talked about, is a big contributor, if not the main contributor to compensation. So how does this change in tax policies affecting your investing practices, and how is this, do you think, affecting your compensation packages to employees?
Full expensing of equipment.
That is a really great question, and I'm going to defer to the distinguished economist on the panel. Thank you so much.
Well, I don't know what they're doing. They don't seem to want to tell us. My expectation, of course, is that will have an impact. That is a provision that expires, and so it may not have the kind of impact that we would hope it would have, depending on the planning horizons of companies and depending on companies' projections about the likelihood of that provision being made permanent. So I think it's kind of a wait-and-see situation.
I'm not sure about the interplay between those. The choices we're making about our people in the investments in the training and the wages and so on are pretty independent of those kind of considerations. What I'd say, though, in terms of the policy more broadly, I think there are a number of things we need to take a look at and rewire for any of this to work. We have this labor policy structure that is more suited to the industrial age, and we're finding constraints in it, both in terms of the flexibility for full-time employees or employees of the company in terms of what we can do to provide additional training or flexible work opportunities and so on, where we just can't. We're a bit hamstrung by legislation around that and regulations. And then similarly, for people who are in the gig economy, not having access to things that feel like traditional benefits, because then does that mean that somehow they're employees and it has to be under a different framework? So there's a bit of rigidity in our rules, which were designed to protect people. So we absolutely need to protect people, the workers, but we may need to reimagine how those rules work to free up people to get more training if they're employees and have access to flexible work, and then for people who are doing the ultimate in flex work to get more access to benefits and things. So again, probably a lot of people in this room are working on that. That's something we're very interested in. And the Rework America task force that I mentioned from the Markle Foundation is trying to look at that as well at state and federal levels, and I'm sure BRT will be getting into that.
Okay, one more. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, my name's Aaron Willens from the National Australia Bank. Great conversation, thank you to everyone on the panel. Just want to pick up on Kathleen's point earlier where you said that 30,000 jobs now exist in Walmart that didn't exist 2 years ago. And the converse is also true. There are a number of jobs in the economy which are being essentially made redundant through advances in technology, and that would be particularly acute for Amanda, I would imagine. I'm just wondering, you're talking about how you're investing in your employees, and I think a lot of the programs you've mentioned are really positive. But do you actually place targets on the amount of those new types of jobs that you're seeking to fill through your current employee base, as opposed to trying to get, as Chris alluded to, those cybersecurity experts, right, who are very difficult to train up from, the handling line. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's challenging, particularly given the pace at which technology is impacting some sectors of the economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's something that we're working through as we speak, that longer-term talent strategy at a very micro level in terms of roles, skills required, and how can we help our folks through this lifelong learning platform that I talked about move across that lattice into things that make sense for them as individuals. So you were asking earlier about the tight labor market, and if that goes away, will people want to do any of this anymore? One of the reasons I talked about just competitive, dynamics in sectors as an incentive, but another one is future of work, technology, automation, and so on, that's changing the nature of all of our jobs. And as Chris was pointing out, to some extent, it's creating new pathways and new, verticals. So the 30,000 was just for one role. We have a lot of other roles that are kind of increasing and so on. So that's certainly true. We have, thousands of technologists, which 20 years ago Walmart I don't think had a single one perhaps. But every job is changing in terms of the role of technology and how we conduct that role. So the way we're coming at it is to lay out what are the different roles we have, what are the skills required, what's going to be needed this year, next year, as far as we can see into the future, and then to marry that with our development program that includes the education, but also exposure, experience, even our evaluation system. So we were talking about the 3 Ps, that's our 4 Es, right? And so with that professional development system, create the pipeways or the pathways that allow people to move from where they are now into that. So, depending on the role, if we can create paths for our own internal people, that's going to be the best option for us. And then there will be some where we'll want to hire from the outside, specialized expertise or what have you. But, ideally, we're creating opportunities for our own folks to advance.
But there's a generational aspect to this in that, and I want to put in a word for the over 50 crowd, where the technology advances or changes in the workplace are more, I think, Chris, you're indicating that they're much more challenging to an older crowd than to the younger people coming into the workplace. And I wondered if you're purposeful about that. We talk here at AI a lot about the sort of middle-class male worker who expected to be in the same industry for a long time. Things have changed, and they have dropped out. Mm-hmm. And so is there a purposefulness about that generational challenge? Well,
and it's easy for the conversation to lean towards IT jobs. One other opportunity we've found that is a great pathway with our large hourly blue-collar workforce is actually sales. Sales is a job that has changed dramatically just over the last 7 years, in that when we walk into and talk to customers today, it's not just the relationship, glad hand, lunch, dinner. No, you got to talk in detail about their logistics business and how to add value. And what we're finding is the workers who actually
know how it works,
know how the operation works, right. We can train them to sell and engage, and that becomes a very purposeful pathway, and that middle-aged worker becomes perfect for those opportunities.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I was just going to jump in specifically because I think that there's a lot of conversation about, does the branch go away, to your point about, how are we thinking about it? We're at a point where we're really leaning in. We're opening 400 new branches sort of in this region, And we're trying to, but we're thinking about how to change the experience, right? And so maybe we don't necessarily want people, the mobile, right, is a really efficient way in which to drive transactions, but we're thinking about what should the experience be in the branch. And so, for example, in certain neighborhoods, we're thinking about how do we combine our philanthropic footprint. So how can we leverage skills training programs to actually embed in certain branches? How do we use it as a convening space for community? How do we really make it a place where people want to go, as opposed to I have to go because I need to do X, Y, and Z? I would also point out that as a firm overall, 40% of our jobs are filled by internal applicants. And so to the earlier question from the gentleman from Brookings, that is really significant, 40% of all jobs. And when you get even more senior in the company, 55% of senior level jobs are filled by internal applicants. So when we say that we want to build that long-term career, we really do want to develop that talent, and we do really want to make sure that not only people have access to get into the company and the skills, but then have the opportunity to grow once we're there.
Okay, this has been a great discussion. I want to thank our panelists very much for being here, and thank all of you for being here as well, and those on the live stream as well. Thank you very much.
That was great.